I was very pleased recently to see this album shouted out as one of the best albums of 1986 on the Hudson Valley Squares episode on that topic. Ryan Scow, that was amazing. And I think that in lieu of that, I might read out the history from a free encyclopedia of this amazing group, this industrial pioneer test department, composed of many members, this wonderful and very innovative, creative, imaginative, abrasive, daring UK act. In particular, the focus shall be upon this 1986 album, The Unacceptable Face of Freedom. Let's read out some history. Test Department is a British industrial music group from London, England that was one of the most important and influential early industrial music acts. Their approach was marked by the use of found material, reconstructed to better serve their purpose of making more with less. The group formed in the London suburb of New Cross in 1981. The core members of the group are Graham Cunnington, Paul Jamrosi, Jonathan Toby Burden, Paul Hines, and Angus Farquhar. Other members who played with the group at various times included Alastair Adams, Neil Starr, John Ecott, Andy Cowton, Tony Cudlip, David Coulter, Liz Rankin, Gus Ferguson, Martin King, Simon Hyde, Russell MacDonald, and Katie Jane Garside. Comedian Vic Reeves played bass in an early incarnation of the band. The band signed to Some Bizarre Records, a label connected to acts like Depeche Mode, Soft Cell, Verver, Cabaret Voltaire, PTV, Fetus, and Swans. The slides and film for Test Department multimedia events are made by visual director Brett Turnbull. Their discography spans a wide variety of influences and styles, including a collaboration of the South Wales Striking Miners Choir in support of the miners' strike of 1984. They were particularly notable for complex and powerful percussion, as well as high-energy live performances. Like the German band Einstürzend Neubauten, another Some Bizarre label signing with whom they are often compared, Test Department used unconventional instruments such as scrap metal and industrial machinery as sound sources. However, Test Department's use of these objects was far more rhythmic than was Neubauten's, and was often accompanied by film and slideshows. The group were noted for large-scale events in unusual site-specific locations, such as the Bishop's Bridge Maintenance Depot at Paddington Station, Arch 69 and Titan Arch near Waterloo Station, Cannon Street Station, Stirling Castle, and the disused St. Rollox Railway Works in Glasgow. Test Department were also active in the 1980s underground tape scene, with many of their earliest releases being available only on cassette. The band's album, The Unacceptable Face of Freedom, was praised by a music reviewer for the New York Times, claiming the album was notable for a sophisticated use of sound collage techniques and the helter-skelter momentum of its cyclical rhythms. In the 1990s, the band's music became less industrial and took on many of the properties of techno. The band's political stance was energized by the passing of the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act 1994. The band split up in 1997, but its former members have continued to work in the fields of art and culture. Angus Farquhar helped re-establish the ancient Gaelic Beltane Fire Festival, held yearly on the night before/morning of the 1st of May on Edinburgh's Carlton Hill. Farquhar also formed NVA, an innovative theatre company specialising in large-scale site-specific events. Cunnington, who suffers from chronic rheumatoid arthritis, produced a one-man show in 1996 called Pain, recounting his experience as a sufferer from this condition. Jamrosi works for the performance group C Free Free. Their album, Ballad of Reading Jail, the Cacophonetta, was released on Cold Spring Records. Gus Ferguson teaches music to orphans in Kathmandu and young Buddhist monks in northern India. The core of the original group re-emerged in 2014 to engage with the current cultural and political climate, exploring new ways of expression in a strategic program of actions. Their large-scale film installation DS30 utilised Dunstan Staiths, an industrial landmark on the River Tyne in Gateshead, and was commissioned by AV Festival to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the UK miners' strike. The DS30 film from the event then toured former mining community areas in the UK. They subsequently released Total State Machine, a large book documenting their history via PC Press Publishing in 2015. The group began playing again in 2014 as Test Department Redux. The current lineup includes Zell Kaute, Kaute, David Altweger, Charles Poulet, and scales up with additional performers for large-scale events. These include Ashley Davies, Rob Lewis, Alex Nim, and Franziska Anna Faust. Further Test Department Redux gigs followed in 2016, including the London gig supported by Electropunk's Feral 5. In 2017, the band organised a three-day festival titled Assembly of Disturbance, featuring an exhibition of TD manifestos and films, Culture is Not a Luxury, Malcolm Pointer's sculpture Horseman of the Apocalypse, speakers, DJs, and other contemporary performers. These include a new TD project, Prolacult, with kinetic sculpture from auto, pneumatics, and subsonic frequencies from disinformation. They released a new album, Disturbance, as Test Department, along with their entire back catalogue on the One Little Independent Records label in 2018. And finally, I'd like to close this upload here by reading out this article from Mark Fisher, which he published in 2015 for Frieze.com, Frieze, Test Department, where leftist idealism and popular modernism collide. Better understood as a popular modernist collective, Test Department made records pulsing with panic and were one of the last examples of post-punk. There's something very timely about the return of Test Department. Their installation DS30 2014, the accompanying film, and the book Total State Machine 2015, a comprehensive history and critical study of the band, have arrived just in time for the deep crisis of neoliberalism in the UK. Test Department were always more than a musical group. They are better understood as a popular modernist collective that had the production of sound at its centre, but which also made visuals, projections, and films. Test Department were formed in London in 1981 by Jonathan Toby Burden, Graham Cunnington, Angus Farquhar, Paul Hines, and Paul Jamrosi. They began as a second-wave industrial act, following on from a first wave led by Throbbing Gristle and Cabaret Voltaire. With their use of found metal objects and their performances in spaces of labour and logistics, disused factories, transport hubs, Test Department offered what seemed, on the face of it, to be a very literal take on the industrial. Via their involvement in a number of UK struggles, including the miners' strike 1984-85 and the anti-poll tax movement 1988-91, Test Department also became intensely invested in the politics of the industrial and the post-industrial. Test Department's signature sound is intensely percussive, a convulsive dance music that took its inspiration from Soviet constructivism, but which became something like the British equivalent of the politicized US hip-hop group Public Enemy. The records are sonic mosaics, pulsing with panic, the sampled voices of Tory MPs countered by defiant statements by left-wing militants. One of Test Department's most powerful tracks, Statement, from the 1986 album The Unacceptable Face of Freedom, features miner Alan Sutcliffe giving a moving account of police brutality during the strike. The track is a work of emotional engineering, a collectivist response to the manipulation of affect and desire through advertising, branding, and political propaganda. Sutcliffe went on to tour with the group, one example of the way in which struggles produce not only new alliances but new social spaces in which art-making ceased to be a matter for specialists of a certain age. For any British left-wing person remembering the mid-1980s is liable to provoke a sadness that is visceral, choking, wrenching. I still can't recall without weeping the day when the miners returned to work in 1985 after a year on strike. What I have called capitalist realism, the deeply embedded belief that there is no alternative to capitalism, was definitively established in the UK during that period, in Margaret Thatcher's second term in government. For a significant proportion of the population, the 1982 Falklands War had transformed Thatcher from a figure of loathing into a glorious war leader. This renewed popularity, together with the formation of the Social Democratic Party by Labour Party defectors, allowed the Tories to achieve a landslide victory in the 1983 general election. It proved to be a traumatic defeat for the British left in general, and for the Labour Party in particular. Labour began its long march towards Blairism and its eventual complete capitulation to neoliberalism and corporate tyranny. Meanwhile, the crushing of the miners' strike and the wave of privatisations that the Tories unleashed created the conditions for the neoliberal Britain that is only now falling apart 30 years later. In retrospect, it can look as if the whole of the 1980s was a series of defeats from the left. One value of Total State Machine is to remind us that it didn't feel that way at the time. Rather, like John Akomfra's video installation The Unfinished Conversation 2013, the Total State Machine book invokes a forgotten 1980s, in which style culture was synchronized with the rise of an anti-authoritarian left that confidently laid claim to a new modernity, set to dispense with capital, patriarchy, and racism as so many historical relics. A 1980s in which radical chic and designer socialism weren't dirty words but real possibilities. Total State Machine includes a section of Cynthia Rose's 1991 book Design After Dark. Inspired by a Test Department performance, Rose argues that young Britons would succeed in staging a dance floor revolution. It would not be the Komsomol-style overthrow dreamt of by Red Wedge, the ill-fated attempt by a collective of musicians led by Billy Bragg, Paul Weller and Jimmy Somerville to spearhead a campaign to defeat the Tories in the 1987 general election. Instead, it will come about through grassroots change, successive waves of guerrilla sounds, guerrilla design, guerrilla entertainments. The new design dynamic will be an impulse born out of celebration, rising out of leisure enacted as an event, and it will change young people's perception about what entities like design and communication should do. Sadly, it didn't work out that way. Rose is absolutely right that most of the innovative energy in British music culture would come from dance music, which is about to enjoy its most fecund, F-E-C-U-N-D, period ever. but the atmosphere around rave, jungle, and garage tended towards the apolitical, the libertarian, or the capitalist. The alliance of the left with the new technologies, energies, infrastructures, and forms of desire that Rose saw emerging was to be very short-lived. The comparison with Red Wedge is instructive here. Part of the problem with Red Wedge was that, despite taking its name from a poster designed by L. Lisztsky, Beat the Whites of the Red Wedge, 1919, its music represented a retreat from modernist experimentalism. Bragg's blokish neo-folk, the ham-fisted jazz-funk pop Weller made with the Style Council, the Communard's strangely depressing party music, none of this was capable of articulating a future. It was all bogged down in the worst kind of 1980s gloss. Test Department were one of the last examples of what has been called post-punk, but really they are part of a longer trajectory of art pop/pop art going back to the 1950s. The conditions for this popular modernism were subject to sustained attack in the mid-80s, and they have never recovered. The Tories began to dismantle the infrastructure of social security, higher education maintenance grants, squatting and art schools that had given working-class people access to the resources of so-called high culture and time to produce their own sound, fiction, and art. But the neoliberal capitalism that drove this assault on culture is now heading for disaster in Greece, in Spain, in Scotland, and finally in England. Far from being some static monument to a bygone era, Total State Machine is an invaluable archive, an inventory of strategies, gestures, and techniques that can now be repotentiated by others ready to begin where the Test Department of the 1980s left off. Rose's prophecies of a new design dynamic can yet come true. Popular modernism isn't dead. It has merely had a 30-year hiatus. Nearly 40 year at this point.